thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity to come aside, to learn, to grow, to have a deeper understanding of where some of these issues come from in ourselves or others. We ask for openness of heart, mind, and spirit as we consider these ideas and solutions that go with them. We pray your Holy Spirit would be with Michelle as she speaks to us, and that we would gain a lot from this time and use it not only for our own benefit, but also the benefit of others. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with Michelle. I think many of you have heard her here. She is very much in demand. Some of you have requested and told us how much you've enjoyed her teachings as we've had her on before. But Michelle attended the University of North Florida. She earned her master's in mental and clinical health counseling. After graduate school, she earned her PhD in clinical sexology and specializes in sex addiction, pornography addiction, love addiction, betrayal trauma, affair recovery, and sex therapy. In April 2018, Michelle began her certified sex addiction therapist training. She provides individual couples groups at her office for men struggling with addiction and women suffering from betrayal. So you may not know anything about this subject, but it is a very important one and a very popular one to discuss. And the subject is attachment theory and sex addiction recovery. And Michelle will speak to us till around 11:45 or 10:12, somewhere around in there. And then we'll take as many questions as we can before the close. So Michelle, over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to share my screen. I usually don't use PowerPoints, but I just put some notes down on a PowerPoint to help kind of walk through. So let me just share. Jay, do you think you could?
Oh, yes. Sorry. I will do that. And okay, share screen. And I'm going to, wait a minute. No, I need to make you the host, right? So let me go to you. I'm going to make you the co-host.
Thank you.
All right. So you should be good to go there.
All right. So today I have the privilege of speaking with you all on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, both as an individual who's done work herself on understanding just how my past shows up in my present. And I feel like the basis of just the sex addiction recovery model developed by Patrick Carnes has given me such a wonderful foundation. But what I've realized is there's a lot more to sexual addiction recovery. And so I've begun to focus on some areas in which I've felt have benefited the clients that I've worked with. And attachment theory is one of those, as well as family systems. And so today I'll be speaking with you about attachment theory and how attachment theory and sexual addiction go hand in hand together. So when I began my work with sexual addiction, I knew some details about attachment theory, but I didn't really understand it. And once I did, I began to see the world in a different light. I began to see people differently. And I really began to see that these underlying traumas in childhood, whether overt or covert, had lasting impacts on an individual. And so when I do an individual session with somebody, typically about 2 to 3 sessions in, we begin to talk about the past and childhood experiences. And I think one of the most frequent things I hear is, well, I had a really great childhood. My parents are still together. We had food on the table every night. My dad was really involved. My mom was very loving. And I completely understand that. And I honor that. And one of the things that Jay Stringer talks about in the book Unwanted is really beginning to differentiate between honor and honesty. And we can both honor our family that they have done the best that they could. I think every parent tries to do the best that they can. But what we know is that we don't know everything, and we parent how we've been parented in the past, or we go to the opposite end of the spectrum and we try to do the exact opposite of what our families have done. And so in my beginning work with individuals, it's really beginning to understand those early childhood dynamics and how they play out in our adulthood. And so looking at it through an attachment lens helps us do that. So just to review a little bit about sexual addiction, it's not about sex. It's about so many other things. It's an intimacy disorder. It's a dissociative disorder. It's a disease, a brain disease, and addiction. And then it's also an attachment disorder. And so today we're going to focus on the attachment piece. So there's a biological need in the human brain that is responsible for creating and regulating connection to our attachment figures. And so those attachment figures are typically our mother and our father. And so back in the 50s and 60s, two researchers, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby, began to recognize that there was a connection between an infant and their caregiver. And that connection between that infant and caregiver was just as important as food, water, and shelter. And so if you can think about the 50s and 60s, we're coming off of a generation that is coming out of coming out of the Great Depression. It's about basic needs getting met. Many individuals were emerging from poverty. And so if they were able to provide those basics, that was what was considered enough. And from the generations prior to that, those basics might have been so much better off than the generations prior to that. And so we really have to honor that our grandparents, our parents did the best that they could. But what the research began to show us is that there was some really crucial things missing that go beyond food, water, and shelter. And that was nurture, connection, and security. And Sue Johnson, who was the founder of Emotionally Focused Couples Therapy, wrote a book called Hold Me Tight. And in this book, Hold Me Tight, she references John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And in World War II, there were thousands of children that were orphaned because of the war. And what happened, and what they had this really unfortunate privilege of studying, was the effects of what these children went through as they were orphaned. And so these children, most of them came from loving, caregiving homes. And then all of a sudden, a crisis happens and they're put into group orphanages. And their basic needs were met: food, water, shelter. But that these children would basically sit there without human touch, human connection, human security. And that caused considerable physical health and mental health and emotional health issues and concern as children and later in life. And so John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth began to get really, really curious about, well, they have everything they need. They have the food, the water, and the shelter. What could be going on? And so they began to look at attachment and the key role that that plays. And so the central theme of attachment theory is that primary caregivers who are responsible and responsive to an infant's need allow the child to develop a sense of security. If an infant knows that the caregiver is dependable, it creates a secure basis for the child to explore the world. What this might look like is, one of the more common things I hear is, I was a baby, I was coddled. I was a baby and my parents didn't want to coddle me. And so instead of coddling me, they let me kind of deal with my emotions on my own. But what we know about infants is that they are not able to regulate their emotions on their own. They need their caregivers to do that for them. I don't know if you've ever seen your wives or your daughters or anyone pick up a baby. If they pick up the baby will hopefully soothe. But if they put the baby down, the baby will then try to self-soothe, but they don't have the skills to do that yet. And so what children learn over time is that if I cry, if I'm hungry, if I'm scared, if I'm frightened, that my caregiver is going to come to me and they're going to take care of my needs. And so when this continues to happen, the back and forth between caregiver and child, trust is earned over time. But one of the things that was happening in the 50s and 60s when this research was going on and years prior, decades prior, was that they were not really having the understanding that this emotional, this nurture needed to be brought in as well. And so children would cry for hours and hours. Children would be scared and frightened and told to do that on their own. They were really trying to raise a generation of independent children. And so now we have a lot of independent individuals that really struggle with emotional needs, that of themselves and others. All right, let me go to the next slide. So in attachment theory, there are 4 basic attachment styles. The attachment style that is what we desire to have and what we are striving for is to have a secure attachment, which is that autonomous. I am okay. I both rely on people and people rely on me. I'm comfortable with closeness. I'm comfortable with intimacy. I can depend on my partner, and I'm okay if they depend on me. I can accept my partner's needs as separate of my own needs. And I can also accept that they might not need me, and I don't feel that as rejection. I don't feel overwhelmed or smothered or suffocated when my partner needs me. I can be trusting, empathetic, and tolerant. An individual with a secure attachment is better able to communicate their needs and manage their emotions. And they also tend to have a little bit more insight as to what's going on internally. And they also can be described as sensitive, warm, and very attuned to people. So attunement, recognizing an emotion in other people, and kind of meeting there with that emotion. And so the most common attachment style that I see with individuals working in recovery is an avoidant attachment style and an anxious attachment style. So avoidant is also known as a dismissive, and anxious is also known as preoccupied. So you might hear those terms interchangeably. One of the least common I see is the disorganized, which is a combination of both. And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to speak about disorganized attachment style in too much depth, but I will just give a quick overview right now. It is a little bit more rare to see an individual with a disorganized attachment style has both high avoidance and high anxiety. They are very much uncomfortable with intimacy, but also are very worried about their partner's commitment to love. And so there are two things that are very, very different from each other. And so they combat each other continuously. So I need you, I want you, I don't need you, go away. I need you, I want you, I don't need you, go away. And so those things cause a lot of emotional distress. And so this is something that it's not that it doesn't come up. I just so frequently see more avoidant, especially, and then anxious. And so again, for the sake of time, let's discuss the avoidant and anxious attachment style. All right, so let me get to my notes. Someone who has an avoidant attachment style, it was probably very known as a very independent, self-reliant individual. Many of the individuals I work with, men especially, tend to have, in recovery, tend to have the avoidant attachment style. And back in 2010, Dr. Patrick Carnes and Out of the Shadows quoted that 70% of individuals with sexual addiction come from these rigid, authoritarian, and disengaged, so emotionally disengaged households. And there was also most likely an addiction of some sort present along there. And so what happens with these individuals with these rigid, authoritarian, and disengaged families is they develop an avoidant, they can develop an avoidant attachment style later in life in their adulthood. And so someone who has that dismissive avoidant attachment style might be known, you might have heard this from spouses or from other family members, or even you begin to notice it in yourself in the work that you're doing, that at times you might feel emotionally distant. Your partner might feel like you're continually kind of pushing them away, keeping them at arm's length. In intimate relationships, your partner might have complained or protested about the rejection that they feel. And so there's this kind of idea of an arm's length relationship. An individual who struggles with this avoidance is going to really struggle with the closeness that intimacy has in a relationship. And so closest means that I've lost my autonomy. Closest means that I'm being smothered. I'm overwhelmed with that. And so I need to kind of get away. I need to escape. These individuals tend to become overwhelmed if somebody is relying on them. And those needs from another person can be very dysregulating for them. They might have been described as cooled, just kind of cool to, just kind of, he's not angry, he's not warm, he's just kind of like a colder personality, very stoic, and very, very self-sufficient. And so there tends to be kind of a narrow range of emotions with these individuals. So they tend to be very good in crises, non-emotional, kind of take charge. And so children who have developed avoidant attachment styles later in life come from a family that refused to or did not have the ability to meet the child's needs during distress. They might have actively suppressed the child's emotions, so shamed them for crying, boys don't cry, man up, buck up. So there might have been some shame messages delivered. A family member might have been angry at the child for showing these emotions because the parent themselves is not comfortable with these emotions. And so if you have children, you might have seen that they are our greatest teachers. They show up in many ways that are very triggering for us. And so they become really a reflection of our own insecurities, our own issues. And I don't know why that's like that, but so with a child who comes from this avoidant attachment style, they are going to become very challenged with expressing their emotions, because at one point when they did express their emotions, those needs were not met. And so a child that has learned to take care of themselves, they're not meant to do that. We're not meant to take care of ourselves as children. That's why we have parents and caregivers. And so children don't learn to soothe themselves. They don't learn to take care of themselves. They just learn that I'm not going to get my needs met, and so there's no point in trying. And so in the research that John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth did in the orphanages over in Europe during World War II, noticed that eventually children stopped crying. They stopped needing things. They stopped asking for their needs to be met. And it wasn't because they didn't have needs, it's because they knew that their needs would not be met. And so they kind of formed this self-reliance. One of the things I see so frequently is that the children's mothers themselves or fathers themselves had emotional difficulties. They might have suffered from depression, postpartum depression, a form of addiction within that household. Or the parents of the child, the grandparents of that child who raised the parent will have also struggled with certain things as well. So these things tend to carry on from generation to generation. All right. So how does it show up in our adult life? So individuals who have an avoidant attachment style are extremely independent, self-driven, self-directed. They are highly successful. I work with people who are in very high-achieving professions. They've got great jobs. They are in charge of a lot of responsibilities, and they do it well. Some individuals might be described as workaholics themselves, where they identify more with their job. They prefer those interactions with their job because there's not an emotional component, and they are successful in those environments. In their intimate relationships with their spouses and or their children, they can seem distant or rejecting, and again, keeping them at arm's length. Communication is more intellectual versus emotional. So they're not necessarily going to speak about the feelings that are there, going to speak about the context of what's happening. They also will tend to avoid conflict. And so if I grew up in a home where conflict wasn't displayed, it wasn't worked out in a healthy way, or if there was conflict and I was upset or angry or sad and I was shamed about that, I'm going to learn to be very uncomfortable with conflict. Or if I had a lot of volatility in my home and all I saw was conflict, I might go to the opposite end of the spectrum in my adult life. And I don't want to rock the boat. I've seen too much conflict. I've dealt with that my entire life. I just want peace. And so these individuals have a lot of needs, but they know that they can't express them, or they don't know how to express them because they didn't have these opportunities earlier in life. And so, when it comes to an emotional need, they might internally have this need, but they don't externally know how to express it or don't feel comfortable expressing it. Intimacy can tend to be a loss of independence. And so they prefer an individualized versus a togetherness experience. Some might be labeled as commitment phobias. And so they might have had spouses that really kind of drove the train on, let's get married, let's get engaged, let's have children. And so they might have had a spouse that kind of had to push them with ultimatums into some of these big life commitments. And if they did commit to big life commitments, there was a part of them that then felt very trapped, or like they weren't able to regulate themselves in this relationship. They need, my partner needs so much of me, my children need so much of me, and I don't know how to meet their needs. I know how to take care of myself. And so they tend to have an exit strategy. And so as I lead into the next slide, how does it show up with sexual addiction? So when I mentioned that exit strategy, individuals with the avoidant attachment style tend to have, let me just make sure I get my, here we go. Individuals with avoidant attachment style tend to look more like a love avoidant. So I don't know if you've heard of love addict, love avoidant, but they tend to show up with more of these love avoidant characteristics. And so it's kind of a catch and release mentality of, I need you, I want you, I don't need you anymore, I don't want you anymore, move away. And so it can kind of feel like a push-pull in these relationships. And so they might be physically present. And many of the times when individuals talk about their parents or even themselves, they're physically present. They go to all the football games, they sit at the dinner table every night, they're on all the family vacations, but they are mentally disengaged. They are mentally somewhere else. And so they might not have emotional connections with individuals, including their children. Their partners might yearn for this. They might ask for this. It might be a very common topic of conflict that the couple has. And some of the partners might think, well, it's just not capable. You know, John is a very, strong, independent guy. He meets our needs as far as financial stability, like he brings that paycheck home. But when I'm sad, when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm scared, when I'm frustrated, I can't bring those emotions to him. Even though I want to, I can't bring them to him. And so again, this stems from the childhood and it shows up in our life. And so with avoidant attachment style, with that exit strategy, these people who struggle with avoidance will need something to turn to in order to regulate themselves. And so I look at addiction as a form of regulating. So when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm anxious, when I'm scared, when I'm frightened, when I'm bored, when I'm lonely, I need to regulate and to get back to my place of equilibrium and self-soothing. And so I'm going to turn to something in order to get that. So I might turn to sex, drugs, food. And so I turn to this substance, I turn to this process to get my needs met, to regulate myself. And so that's that exit strategy. Many of the individuals with the avoidant attachment style, I see this a lot with pornography addiction. I also see this a lot with more transactional forms of sexual activity. So things where they are not necessarily going to be needed. So if you can think about a traditional affair, there might need to be a back and forth in that traditional affair of emotions and spending time together. And so other needs beyond just those sexual needs. And so in more of these transactional instances, there's not a need for that emotional connection. So an avoidant will do very well in those relationships because that depth is not needed. The same with pornography. They don't have to do anything to please that individual, to take care of that individual, to meet that individual's needs. They can just take care of themselves. And so if you think about pornography or anything, just kind of this virtual fantasy, it's an escape. And the addict can, kind of get their sexual needs met. They can live in this fantasy world and they don't have to worry about being vulnerable or being rejected. And this is their way of coping. This is the way of viewing pornography allows them to kind of keep this diluted fantasy world that they can escape difficult emotions in their own life. And that might be in their work life, their personal life, but these difficult situations, they have a way to escape it. So they have that exit strategy there. And usually a spouse has been saying this to an individual for a very long time. I feel like you're not with me. I feel like I'm in this alone. Why can't I talk to you about my emotions? Why can't you share my emotions? Their spouses might have seen a lot of distress in this individual. I know that you're sad. I know that you're depressed. I feel like something's going on, but they can't quite figure out what it is. And it is the avoidance that's there. The second attachment style that I see most frequently is the anxious attachment style. So I see this less in men, but it still is there. I see the avoidance quite more frequently, and I see a lot of anxious attachment style in the partners of men struggling with sexual addiction. And so we'll talk about the partner component a little bit later on, but I'll go into how an anxious attachment style is formed and what it looks like in adulthood. All right. So with an anxious attachment style, the child who is crying is not going to be easily consoled. And so a child is picked up, and although their parent is consoling them, their emotions are still unable to be regulated. The child will become upset with the parent. So there's a study, it's on YouTube. I think it's called Strange Theory. I'm probably butchering that name, but they did an experiment on children where they put children in a room with their parent, and for the first couple of minutes, the children and the child and the mother are playing together and they're spending time together. And then the researcher asked the mother to leave the room and exit and leave the child in the room by themselves. And what they saw with these anxious attached children is that the way to solve the child's crying, their distress, is for the mother to enter back into this room and pick the child up and hold them and love on them. But with these anxiously attached children, the child would be picked up and the mother would try to soothe, but the child would look away. The child would almost seem like they were angry or upset. And even though they were crying, they wanted their mother to come back in. That mother comes back in and it still isn't it's not working. But these individuals are also very clingy to their attachment figures. So they're not necessarily soothed by their attachment figures, but they're clingy to their attachment figures. And they tend to have less confidence to explore life, to explore different relationships. They are just kind of generally appearing anxious, biting nails, kind of always needing to know what we're doing next. Very much worried about the future, worried about difficult or hard things happening to them. They don't do well interacting with strangers, and they do have a difficult time regulating those negative emotions. And so with someone that is anxious, they feel this anxiety. And if you felt anxiety, it is one of the most distressing, dysregulating emotions to have. And because they can't handle this and they don't know how to properly handle it, it might come out in more of a rage or more of an anger, but really underneath, it's just that anxiety, and it's how it's coming out is in that anger, that volatility. Let me just take a drink. And so how does it show up in adulthood? Well, an individual who has that anxious attachment style, they're really going to look like they are insecure in a relationship. And so it might not be easy to see on the surface, but underneath there is this kind of consistent worry of something's going on, a fear of being rejected, a feeling of abandonment, a feeling of not being needed. And so I kind of look at individuals with an anxious attachment style as kind of a duck. The duck sits on water, and above water, it looks like it's just kind of cruising around, but underneath it's a lot of this, but we can't see this, we can just see this. So these anxiously attached individuals, that anxiety might not be apparent at first, but underneath they're just treading water, and there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of dysregulation within them. Someone who is anxious might have been told that they are needy, that they have a lot of emotions, that they have a lot of, like, why do you need me to call you every moment? Or when I don't call you throughout the day, why is that so upsetting for you? They need a lot of reassurance that they're not going to be left, that they're going to be needed, that they're going to be wanted, that their partner is going to stand by them. And this can sometimes scare a partner. This can be a little like, like this is strange. This is a little bit uncomfortable for me. I've never been this needed by an individual. And so an anxiously attached individual is going to have the partner's going to have a different response. The partner of an avoidant individual is going to want to come closer to them. So look, as an avoidant is going to turn away and the partner's going to come closer. Whereas the anxiously attached person, here's the anxiously attached person, and they're going to come to the partner and the partner might turn away. And so they're going to just have a lot of what seems to be a lot of needs. They might appear as an overly sensitive person, and they will take a lot of things very personally. They have a lot of emotions, but those emotions are not necessarily brought out in a way that is healthy. They're more argumentative, combative. They have a difficulty regulating that anger, and they put a lot of the responsibility of their well-being on another person. And so these individuals tend to be quite unpredictable. So if you think about when an anxious person comes into a relationship, they are really going to have a lot of preoccupation with what is happening within that relationship. Are we okay? Does she need me? Does she want me? And that little looming fear of abandonment and rejection is there. And again, that stems from earlier in life. If we had a parent that inconsistently met our needs, if we had a parent that was with us one moment emotionally, but then not the next, we don't really know how to show up. So my needs might be met or they might not be met. They might be met, they might not be met. And so there's a lot of inconsistency. And all right, so to go on, how does this show up in sexual addiction? So this tends to show up a lot in more of that love addict behavior where they're really going to cling to that partner. The partner might even feel like they need space at times. They might have a fear there that that relationship is ending. They might have fear that that partner's not needed. And so this might show up where I have my primary relationship with my spouse, but I also have other emotional relationships on the side, because when I text this person, even if it's just an online messaging app or a chat room or a webcamming activity, when I message this person, they message me back. And so even if transactional, that messaging back is a way that they regulate themselves, because they're getting that reassurance. Someone out there wants them. Someone out there needs them. These individuals, again, they might have more long-standing affairs. So we're going to see more of the emotional component with these individuals. And then they also might do some of these more exhibitionist behaviors, such as going to strip clubs and or prostitution escorting, because there's not necessarily a way for them to get rejected. With these transactional pieces, I know that I'm never going to have to worry about them pushing me away because it's paid for. It feels like they're meeting my emotional needs, but I don't have to worry about them one day deciding they don't want me anymore. I can regulate that environment by entering when I want to and leaving when I want to. They're going to seek approval and validation. And so what I might hear in my sessions is, you know, when I was with somebody, whether it was an affair, an escort, I felt for the first time that I was finally enough. I was man enough. It felt so good to know that this person looked forward to seeing me, because in their primary relationship, it might be really problematic because there's a lot of distress there. But they can go to these other relationships outside the marriage and they can begin to get these needs met. They even might have multiple relationships going on at the same time, or be taking part in more of these, you know, I have an issue with going and having affairs. I have people that I'm chatting with online. I work with some individuals that is the extent of their behavior, is just this online, you know, kind of sexual toned messaging, because every time that message comes through, it soothes them, it feels good. And so it is a form of reassurance for them. And so I know that I want to be mindful of the time. We got about just a couple minutes. The last part of this is I wanted to chat about how these two things can show up in a relationship. So again, most of the men that I work with are that avoidant attachment style, and they say opposites attract, and boy, is that the case. And so what happens so frequently is the avoidantly attached individual somehow finds the anxiously attached individual. And for that anxiously attached individual, although the avoidance behavior is very distressing for them, because the avoidant is going away from them and the anxiously attached is pursuing them. And so eventually when that avoidant kind of turns to them and says, okay, like, I'll entertain this, I'll talk to you, it fulfills a lot of voids in this anxiously attached person. So I finally am enough that he's looking at me. I'm finally enough that he's talking to me. Oh, he chose to come home today after I've been asking him over and over and over again, let's go to dinner. He decides to come home. And so it fills them. But when that partner turns away, when the avoidant turns away, it distresses them. And so there can be a lot of anger, volatility. And so, and many of the relationships that when I work with couples, this is a huge dynamic that takes place. And each individual, the avoidant and the anxious, are just dysregulating each other throughout this relationship. And so part of what we're doing is working on each person understanding the attachment style and learning to soothe within themselves, and then helping the relationship. I did miss a slide. So can you change your attachment style? Yes, like that is the best news, is that you can. And I feel like that's why I've spent so much time trying to understand attachment theory, because we as children, we can't control the environment that we live in as children. We can't control the relationship our caregivers had with us. But what we can do is later in life work to heal these wounds. And so for both the anxious, the avoidant, the disorganized, working with a therapist is crucial. We have to begin to make sense of our childhood. We have to begin to understand what these dynamics looked like. We have to, for things that are very subtle, which I see, you know, a lot of really kind of obvious abuse with the individuals I work with, but more frequently, I see more subtle abuse. I see a parent that was very depressed and would take a lot of time alone, or had flat affect. I see a a person tell me a father that was always at the dinner table but never spoke, or came home from work every night at 6 p.m. on the dot, but read the newspaper as soon as he walked in the door. Or I see a mother who had, 6, 7, 8 kids, had a lot of overwhelming other things taking her out of, the individualized attention that child needed. And so there wasn't enough emotion to go around. And so there can be a lot of mental health concerns that are with those parents, and or just environmental concerns that can lead to this. And so individual therapy, highly recommend it. Look for a therapist that's trained in attachment theory that understands that. And luckily Jacksonville has a lot of them. An individual with an anxious attachment style, some of the things that they can begin to do is touch base with the emotions that they're feeling, getting comfortable with those emotions. So addiction recovery is about sitting with emotion and knowing that we can survive these difficult emotions. It's really beginning to understand what that feels like in our body and how that shows up in our relationships, and then us doing things differently to respond to the emotions. And so there tends to be a cognitive behavioral therapy that is used, which is cognitive behavior is meant to change a behavior, mindfulness exercises, sitting with emotion, meditating, and then beginning to regulate our emotions in ways that just because we are not getting that affirmation from somebody doesn't define that we're not wanted. So we begin to try to find that self-worth and that self-acceptance within ourselves and not through other people. So I don't need that external validation. I know myself and I'm enough. For the avoidant attachment, same thing as far as learning from that childhood. Individual, family, and couples therapy is, of course, the ideal. Not everyone has the family systems that they can work with this on, but when that does happen, it is quite a beautiful healing experience that can come of that. Someone with that avoidant attachment style is going to need to begin to share more of themselves, talk openly, begin to express feelings, express needs, because they have them. They just might not have the skills in which they would ever learn to express them. I can't tell you how many people have told me, I have no idea what my needs are. And so they begin to develop their sense of self and who they are. They begin to have boundaries. So people with avoidant attachment styles tend to find themselves in maybe some volatile, abusive relationships where there's an enraged partner. She's upset, she's been hurt, she's been betrayed. But they tend to kind of not want to rock the boat with that conflict. And so they're not going to do anything to assert themselves if they feel like something's happened to them that's wrong with them emotionally. They're going to more kind of step back. And so we need to begin in a healthy way to assert this. And so it's really about kind of fostering that healthy self-image and learning to understand those emotions and how they show up. And so it's so beautiful when couples can come together and see how their attachment styles, where they come from, understand themselves, and then recognize what it looks like in that relationship. And so what Sue Johnson with emotionally focused therapy calls it is that couples do a dance. They have this tango that they do where there's the anxious that's like this and the avoidant that's like this. And so we can do this for the rest of our life. We can have this style where, she chases and you run, she chases, you run. And then maybe you turn to her and you yell or you get upset, but then you go back again. And that can go on forever and ever. Or we can choose to do something different, which means working on understanding our attachment style as an individual and then how it shows up in the relationship. And then really as with working with your therapist, if there is that sexual addiction component, how is this attachment affecting my recovery? How is it coming out of my addiction? And so this tends to be a part of addiction recovery that I don't feel like has been addressed as much as it should be. And so really beginning to work on those attachment injuries that happen and really how they show up within the individual, the addiction, and the relationship. Okay. And that's it.
I'm going to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Michelle. There's a lot there to chew on. We're going to open it up now to questions. And as I mentioned before, there are 3 ways you can ask a question. You can go to the chat function and you can direct a question either to Michelle or to me or to the whole group if you choose to do that. You can raise your hand like this and wave and we'll recognize you. And I think there's a hand raising element here somewhere where you can raise your hand and hopefully that'll pop up and we can recognize you. So we have at least 10 minutes, 10 or 11 minutes for questions. And so I'll open it up to you all. I have 3 or 4 questions myself, but I'm going to open it up to you all first. And who would like to ask a question of Michelle at this point? I have one chat question. Can you have an overlap between avoidant and anxious styles?
Yes, certainly. So there's an assessment that I will send to Jay after this, and it's an attachment inventory assessment. And it's not the end-all be-all of understanding your attachment style, but it's a really good way to get a basis of where you fall. Just by some of the dialogue we had today, there might have been some keywords that really resonated with you, like, that's me. Like, yep, that's me, that's me, that's me. But there might also be some parts of you that show up in each one. And so when I did my attachment inventory, that assessment, I came up with actually anxious, avoidant, and secure. And so it's not 100% typically. We tend to have some of each, but there is more of a dominant trait that's there. And so as we look at kind of healing the attachment style, we're more focusing on the dominant trait and then understanding how that less dominant trait comes out. And so if the dominant trait is anxious, then we're going to work on healing that anxious attachment style. But that doesn't mean in certain situations that avoidant isn't provoked and comes out. But if you take that attachment inventory, that attachment quiz, it'll give you a pie graph, and it will most likely, you'll have more of a dominant trait.
Thank you, Michelle.